gaping holes in his chest, which are actually the exit wounds of the bullets. One of the soldiers who was sent to guard him at that point to make sure he didn't escape, although when you look at this picture you realize he wouldn't be able to, he said that Omar looked at him and said, "Shoot me."
I'm showing now for our TV viewers the image in the book of Omar, the very graphic bullet holes you see in his chest. For our radio listeners, you can go on our website, democracynow.org. We're talking to Michelle Shepard. The book is called Guantanamo's Child. So he ends up at Guantanamo. Talk about his treatment, what you can reconstruct of it, what you know of it, what his family knows. Has his family seen him at all at this point? Well, unfortunately, we can't talk to Omar. The Pentagon has a policy that they won't allow detainees to be interviewed. So his treatment I've cobbled together from some of the sources that you mentioned, some of the statements that he's told his lawyers, and interviews that I had with detainees who were kept with him. Both in Bagram and in Guantanamo, the detainees that had been in prison with him said that he was treated worse than some of the other prisoners who were brought in at the time. Partly because he was injured, and he was interrogated right after he was brought in Bagram, when his injuries were quite severe. So that in itself was seen as harsh treatment. He alleges through his lawyers that he was denied medication at this time as well. But I think overall it was the perception that, and the allegations that he had killed a soldier, and for the guards there, they treated him especially harsh because of that. The other prisoners at Bagram and at Guantanamo had been accused of connections with Al-Qaeda, but none had been accused of actually killing a soldier. And from what the other detainees told me, this dogged him for the first couple years anyway, and he was often shouted killer, murderer, butcher, and the guards were especially rough with him. Can you talk about, and I'm showing the image again, of the older brothers of Omar Khadr. These brothers are, one you say worked for the CIA and was freed, another was extradited. That's right. His eldest brother, Abdullah, is facing an indictment in a Boston court for terrorism. He is alleged to have purchased weapons for Al-Qaeda. Now, he's actually fighting his extradition, so he's been in a Toronto jail now for 2 years. But what's interesting to note in his case is that he's been charged in a domestic court, while Omar is classified as an enemy combatant and facing a war crimes trial. Abdullah, who had been picked up by Pakistani forces, brought back to Canada, and then arrested in Canada on the warrant from the U.S., is actually facing a domestic charge. So he's in a Toronto jail. He's fighting his extradition, and he actually has a hearing this week as well, a bail hearing. His other brother, Abdurrahman, is the self-described black sheep of the family, and he had always rebelled against his father. His father had tried to send him to training camps. He often ran away. He was quite notorious for his behavior in Pakistan and Afghanistan. After 9/11, when the family fled, he returned to Kabul, and he was picked up very shortly after 9/11 by the Northern Alliance forces and eventually handed over to the U.S. When he was in Kabul, he was approached by FBI and eventually the CIA, and they asked him to become informant and an agent, which he did. He was later sent to Guantanamo, where they wanted him to spy on the other prisoners, but he didn't last very long there. At one point, he was able to shout to his brother Omar, but they never saw each other there. And I think he was identified pretty quickly in Guantanamo as a mole. So they got him out of there. They sent him to Bosnia. His story is quite incredible. It goes on at length, but just to wrap it up, they sent him to Bosnia. He blew his cover. He came back to Canada and eventually told Canadians his story, and included in telling his story were the details about his father's connection to Al-Qaeda members. He actually said, "We were an Al-Qaeda family," and that made many Canadians dub the Khadr family Canada's first family of terrorism. Michelle Shepard, can you talk about the international treaties around child soldiers, around children?
Well, what Omar's lawyers argued was that the international treaties, in particular, the Convention of the Rights of the Child and the Optional Protocol, prohibit the prosecution of a minor. That they don't explicitly state that a prosecution can't occur, but in the language of the treaties, it protects those under the age of 18 who are captured in armed conflict. In their motion, they had many friends of the court offer submissions as well, many civil and human rights groups, and people such as David Crane, who is the former U.S. prosecutor for war crimes in Sierra Leone. And Crane said that I had the ability, the power, to try those under the age of 18, but I didn't do that. This was all before the military judge. And what the Pentagon argued was that while there hadn't been in modern day history a war crimes trial of someone under the age of 18, international law didn't prohibit it. Ultimately, the Guantanamo judge, as you mentioned, Peter Brownback, agreed with that and cleared the way for his trial.
So what will happen now? You're headed to Guantanamo today, Michelle?
Yes, off to Baltimore actually this evening, and we go back to Guantanamo tomorrow. He has a pre-trial hearing on Thursday. At that point, we believe that the prosecution will again ask for a date to be set for his trial to start. At the last appearing, the judge refused to do that, saying there were still some issues to be dealt with. We're not sure if he's going to do that this time. At this point, the prosecutors and defense are still arguing over disclosure, over what information the defense is entitled to have to prepare for the case. But there's very few obstacles now that remain in the way of trial. Omar's lawyer says really only the intervention of the Canadian government at this point could stop it.
And Michelle Shepard, finally, you're talking to us from Canada. The attitude today of the detention, of the imprisonment of Omar Khadr at Guantanamo for, what, over almost 6 years now, 15 years old when he was picked up.
Well, Amy, it's interesting because Canada finds itself in this very unique position as the only Western nation now to stand beside the Bush administration in support of Guantanamo and its trials. Omar is the only Western citizen that remains there. And over the past 2 weeks, there's been a lot of pressure on Ottawa to intervene in the case. The opposition groups, legal groups, civil human rights groups, and many international groups are demanding to know why Canada supports these trials where they've been condemned elsewhere. At this point, the Conservative minority government here in Canada has said they won't interfere in the process. And I think that has much to do with the reputation of Omar's family here in Canada. They've never been well liked. They've said atrocious things in public, and I think that's overridden any concerns at this point for Omar himself.
Michelle Shepard, thank you very much for being with us, national security reporter for the Toronto Star. Her book, just out, is called Guantanamo's Child, The Untold Story of Omar Khadr. And that does it for today's broadcast. Democracy Now! Is produced by Mike Burke, Shrufa Dokadus, Aaron Mate, Angelique Kama, Jeffrey Hagerman, Steve Martinez, Nicole Salazar, Hani Massoud, Robbie Karen, Mike DeFilippo, Miguel Noguera, Peter Curry's our engineer. Special thanks also to Becca Staley, Hugh Grant, Samantha Chambly, Jason Noor, John Randolph, Kieran Krug Meadows, Rakham Penny, Besta Goddars, and Rabia Alghani. We are continuing our tour around the country. On Wednesday, I'll be at Barnes & Noble on 17th Street, Union Square, here in New York City, this weekend in Michigan, from Detroit to Lansing to Ann Arbor to Grand Rapids. We are also looking for an outreach director at democracynow.org. Especially happy birthday to Dennis Moynihan. I'm Amy Goodman. Thanks so much for joining us. This is